Welcome back to yet another installment of the Big Book Challenge. This month, my patrons have selected a massive book and a very hyped book for me to read in this spoiler-filled vlog for you. It is, of course, Babel by RF Kuang. Babel, however you want to say it. This book is chunky. My copy is 542 pages, and honestly, the size of this book is a major intimidating factor. But the other one is just the hype and the love around this book. I mean, this was, if not it was definitely one of the biggest books of last year. And it was certainly a favorite here on BookTube. Now, I have been on a bit of a historical fantasy kick lately. In fact, I just did a video where I read 7 historical fantasy books and I had a great time. So if ever there was a time for me to be diving into this dark academia historical fantasy, it was now. I know RF Kuang is quite famous for her Poppy War trilogy, and then of course Yellowface has also been a massive hit. I have not read anything by this author yet though, so this will be my first foray into the world of Kuang. I think for the most part, this book has provoked some pretty incredible conversation, and I am excited to finally be able to be a part of that conversation. Now, this book, it's chunky, but it is actually broken up into 5 books. I got here book 1, and last night I did actually read the very first book, so I'm already 90 pages in, and so far I really like it. So let's have a little bit of a chat about book 1, which is essentially the introduction. At the very beginning of the book, we meet a young Chinese boy living in Canton, and essentially his whole family has recently died from the plague. When we meet him, his mum passed away that morning, and he is sick too, and he's lying next to her body waiting to die himself. But before he passes away, a white English man kind of just like waltzes into the house and places a bar of silver on this boy's chest. They speak some words and magically the boy is healed. We find out that this man's name is Professor Lavelle, and he is very detached from this whole situation. Professor Lavelle tells this boy that he can stay in Canton and he will live a life of misery and poverty, or he can come with him and have all the comforts he could dream of, as long as he commits himself to study. And so obviously this boy does not have much of a choice. He agrees, and then he's prompted to come up with an English name for himself. He chooses Robin. And off they go to England. And Robin is forced to leave behind everything he was, everything he knew, everyone he loved. He knows what his life would look like if he'd stayed in Canton. Poverty, and he can see what his life will look like if he appeases this professor. And so there is this level of gratitude, and it seems like the professor even expects quite a strong level of gratitude, but there are some simmering doubts in Robin's mind, even if he doesn't let himself linger on those too long. For example, if the man could cure somebody so easily and so quickly, why hadn't he shown up just a few hours earlier to save his mum? Of course, there's other questions like, why has Professor Lovell chosen Robin? Robin realizes pretty quickly that the nanny that he's always had and the books that he's always had must have come from Professor Lovell. Professor Lovell even makes Robin like sign this agreement of guardianship so that Robin can officially and legally be Professor Lovell's ward. Professor Lovell is not adopting him as a son. He is just becoming his guardian. And Professor Lovell makes it very clear that those are two very different things, and he has made a clear choice. Robin is his ward, not his son. Even though Robin does have suspicions that Professor Lovell might actually be his father. Anyway, pretty much immediately once they arrive in England, Robin is put into a bunch of classes to learn a bunch of languages. Robin doesn't have any contact with any kids his age. He doesn't really have any sense of warmth or love in his life. Certainly not coming from Professor Lovell himself. And that is especially highlighted in one scene that made me realize just how brutal this book is going to get. Like, I knew it was going to be dark and I knew it was going to tackle some heavy themes, but this book is just going to be violent, isn't it? I can see it already. So basically what happens is one day Professor Lovell and Robin are out and Professor Lovell buys Robin a book. So he goes home and he starts reading and he's just enthralled with this story. When suddenly Professor Lovell bursts in and Robin realizes that 3 hours have passed. But this mistake has meant that he is an hour late for one of his language lessons. And Professor Lovell is furious. Robin tries to apologize and to explain, and he quickly tries to like dash down to go to his class, but before he can leave the room, Professor Lovell stops him and basically just gives him this horrible beating. And obviously this is humiliating, it's painful, it's terrifying. Then we kind of jump forward several years and Robin is now being accepted into Oxford. Specifically, he is going to be a student at the Translation Institute. And this is an extremely prestigious institution, and it's also where Professor Lovell works. We learn a little bit about the different departments at the institute, the most fancy of which is like on the top floor of the tower, and that's where they use silver to perform magic. Because it seems like in this world, translation can be kind of used as a form of magic, and silver is kind of the medium through which that magic is conducted. And at Oxford, the Translation Institute is the only kind of department or area that accepts non-white, non-male students. And so this is the first time since he left Canton that Robin is meeting other people of colour. He quickly becomes friends with a young man his age named Remy, who is from Calcutta. And there are just 2 other students in their cohort who are 2 women. One's black, one's white. And already we're getting some pretty clear indications of the racism that is inherent in an institution like Oxford. But there's also some other suggestions about the way that the Translation Institute in particular has been used as a method, even maybe a weapon of empire and colonialism. There was one line in particular that stood out to me though, and that was when they were having the tour of the tower, and one of the professors is explaining how, you know, all of their translation is done by hand and it's stored in the tower for up to a year. And Robin makes the observation that, well, like if anything happened to the tower, would that mean that you just lose like a whole year's worth of work? And the professor tells him that, you know, everything is super protected by magic. And so like the tower, there's no way that the whole tower would burn down. And I was immediately like, the tower's gonna burn down, isn't it? And during this tour and talking about how incredible the Translation Institute is, this professor even says, translation makes possible communication, which in turn makes possible the kind of diplomacy, trade and cooperation between foreign peoples that brings wealth and prosperity to all. And I mean, that all sounds quite lovely, but you and I, we know about the British Empire, and wealth and prosperity was very much a one-way deal with the British Empire. So it's interesting kind of watching these people kind of put themselves and their art up on this pedestal of goodness and moral rightness. Anyway, there was one other thing that happened, but I don't quite know the implications or where it's going just yet. Basically, on his very first night at Oxford, Robin's by himself and he kind of runs into a group of people who are clearly stealing silver. And one of these people looks just like Robin and he speaks to him in Chinese asking for his assistance. And so Robin, despite himself, kind of runs over and helps them a little bit. And the one who looks just like him says to Robin to come and meet him in a particular place at a later date. And he's literally described as Robin's doppelganger. I don't know, my first thought was just that he is Robin's brother or half brother. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. It was a pretty small part of the book so far, but I feel like it's going to come back. So like I said, I'm only 90 pages into this 500+ page book, but I'm already invested. I'm scared. I'm scared about what's going to happen. I'm scared about what is going to happen to Robin, but also what he's going to do. That's the feeling I have, because his characterization so far has just been of a boy who is really quite sweet and tender-hearted and has just been kind of thrust by Professor Lovell into this whole situation. And there is a lot of like emotional complexity already building within the character of Robin. We haven't learned a lot about the specifics of the magic just yet, but briefly to the students we do get a little bit of a hint. They say, no, the power of the silver bar lies in words, more specifically the stuff of language that words are incapable of expressing. The stuff that gets lost when we move between one language and another. The silver catches what's lost and manifests it into being. And I think that's really interesting. It's all the little nuances and bits of context between languages that you wouldn't get unless you were embedded in that culture and in that experience. And it seems like that is why the Translation Institute is the only place that accepts people of colour and women, because often they are the people who have been embedded in those cultures and those languages. So they would have a deep intrinsic sense of the meaning of words that a foreigner, like coming from England to just learn a language for a year or so, would not have access to. And so in a way, it is their lived cultural experience that the British Empire seems to be weaponizing in this magic system itself. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself and I'm really enjoying it so far. I'm really, really liking the tone, the atmosphere, and like the implications of the things that we're talking about and exploring. And the characters. So many of the characters I'm already invested and interested in. I mean, of course, Robin is number one, but then Remy as well. And the girls that they've just met too. And one thing that a lot of the students have in common, especially the students who are not from England, is that they have guardians who have brought them from a foreign land to England to participate in this program. So essentially it's a bunch of young people who have been taken from their families, from their homelands, given opportunities, but at a great cost to their sense of self, identity, and connection. But all of that is just the first 90 pages. So I will come back to you after I've read book 2 and let you know what kind of mess we're in by that point. Wish me luck. Last night I finished book 2 and today I want to get stuck into book 3. So we need to do this update now. I have notes. I have so many notes. Usually when I take notes, it's because I have this compulsive desperation to get down everything I hate about a book. But in this case, I'm just having an awful lot of thoughts because so much is going on in this book. Basically, book 2 covers the first 3 years of Robin and his cohort at Oxford. So by the end of book 2, they've finished their 3rd year and they're about to enter their 4th. During that time, a lot has happened. Where do I even start? I suppose I'll start with our cohort. So that's Robin, Remy, and then the 2 girls I mentioned. Letty is the white girl who I think is the only one who has had the proper British upbringing. She still is a bit of an outsider, obviously being a woman, but she has a lot more access to the social capital and the cultural understanding that Oxford kind of expects of a lot of its students. And then Victoire, I think is how you say the other girl's name. She's Haitian, so one of her specialities is French, but she's also very interested in Creole. So it's just these 4, Robin, Remy, Victoire and Letty, who are going through the Oxford Institute of Translation at the same time. They're in the same year together. And so through their 3 years so far, they obviously become very close. There are definitely tensions in their friendships, but the friendship that we get the most detail on is definitely Robin and Remy. The girls kind of have to live off campus, so they're a little bit separated. And I think the dynamic between the 4 of them is really interesting, like I kind of alluded to in the last section, with 3 of them sharing the experience of having been brought from their homelands to England by a guardian. The details of those circumstances are different for all 3, but they do definitely seem to share some kind of inherent appreciation for the experience of being removed from their homeland and just the complexities and the nuances of the feelings that they have about being at Oxford and their position there. I think the 4 of them together, they kind of represent several different ways in which people can not belong or never completely belong. For all 4 of them, they have been accepted into Oxford, but their acceptance truly into the culture of Oxford and into a sense of community at Oxford is, either entirely denied or at best, it's conditional. And I think through these 4 friends and their different experiences in particular, Kuang is really highlighting some very interesting things around social capital and social mobility. And if it wasn't obvious right from the get, it's very apparent now that even though Babel considers itself to be quite a progressive faculty of Oxford, it's made very clear to us that Oxford and Babel in particular value diversity and diverse experience insofar as that diverse experience can be valuable to them. Which means that our 4 characters are continuously put into a position in which they need to prove themselves worthy of being there, and often proving themselves of their own humanity. This book is very much highlighting how so often institutions back in the 1800s, in the case of Babel, but I think also today, see diversity as a good thing only insofar as it can be profitable, as it can be leveraged. Not because treating people well, even people who are different from us, should be the standard. And I think any other kind of justification for diversity or for acceptance is always going to leave people behind, but it's also going to leave those people who do manage to make it forward in a really precarious position, because it essentially sets up our humanity as contingent, as conditional, rather than innate. And that is how the Institute of Babel views our cohort. Although the 4 of them do have a really interesting and special connection, and they do appreciate each other's experiences in ways that other people just are not capable of, or have not shown any interest in, by virtue of the fact that they are 4 individuals with 4 different experiences, they do obviously interpret and interact with this whole situation differently. And so there is some really interesting tensions that do arise between the 4 of them in terms of how they are each choosing to interact with their current situation and their environment, and how they're choosing to interpret it or think about it or feel about it. And I think through those 4 characters in particular, the book is also exploring some themes around intersectionality. For example, Robin is Asian and he is seen as a Chinaman here, but he is mixed race. His father is white, and so in some cases he can kind of pass for white. Meanwhile, Victor and Remy, they have dark skin. And so there is no way that they can pass for white in this society, despite their incredible education, regardless of the fact that they have access to money or the fact that they've been trained in like manners and social mores. There is just no way that they have access to like the inner circle. Meanwhile, Letty, she kind of does. She has literally been brought up in this whole culture, but because she's a woman, she was only allowed to come to Oxford after her older brother died. And so these four very different experiences are kind of being played out in really quite interesting ways. Letty is very much giving the vibes of an ally who's trying, but maybe not trying hard enough. She loves her friends and she wants to support them, but when they tell her something about their experience, she isn't quite willing to believe it. And she also seems at least somewhat unwilling to accept responsibility when her decisions and her influence end up harming her friends. There's another conflict that Letty and Victoire have in particular when, for their kind of like major assignment for the year, they have to choose a text to translate into English that hasn't been translated before. And Victoire's really excited. She wants to kind of basically create a grammatica for Creole, but it is deemed unimportant. And instead, Babel wants her to translate some voodoo texts. And Victoire is really upset by this. She is very hesitant and she feels like she's crossing a line and she doesn't want to do this. And Letty just doesn't get why, because in her mind, Victoire, she doesn't even practice voodoo herself. She didn't even grow up in that culture because she was taken from it. And so if Victoire, even though she doesn't have like a direct personal spiritual connection with these texts, she does understand that they come from a closed culture. And so her translating them feels like a betrayal. And the complexity there of the fact that this does belong to the culture that she was taken from. Like, this could have been hers. It could have been her culture. But now she's being asked to translate it for the people who took her from that culture. Her desire to protect the sanctity of something that could have been hers and that matters to the people who could have and should have been her family. Like, that is entirely understandable. And yet Letty just like can't see that. One of the other big things that we start learning about more in this book is the silver trade and like how magic and silver is so highly concentrated in England and essentially controlled by the British. Like going back to the first book, for example, and Robin having the realization that, you know, if Professor Lovell had only shown up a few hours earlier, he could have very easily saved his mother too. But when he kind of raises this in a more like generalized way of asking why silver isn't accessible to people who need it everywhere, it's just very quickly and simply dismissed as, well, silver's expensive. What do you expect us to do? But the more he becomes embedded in Oxford and in Babel, and he sees the ways in which these silver bars are being used, which are for very frivolous things for rich people, or in some pretty serious ways, like making weaponry a whole lot stronger and more powerful. Essentially, he sees quite clearly that silver and this magic is a comfort and a luxury of the wealthy and a weapon of empire. And so he has this kind of like sense that this whole silver business is unethical, it's unfair, it's unjust, but he's not really sure what to do about it. That is until he meets up again with Griffin. Now, I did mention Griffin briefly when we were talking about the previous book, although not by name. Griffin is the person that Robin helped steal some of the silver and who looks just like him. They meet up again about a week after that first event happened, and Griffin introduces himself and reveals that he is, in fact, Robin's half-brother. He was brought to Oxford by Professor Lovell just like Robin was about 5 years earlier. During his time at Oxford, he saw how horrible and wrong everything was, and so he joined up with a secret society named the Hermes Society. We don't know a lot about them, but what we do know is that Griffin's a part of it and they steal silver from Babel. Griffin tells Robin that they redistribute it to where it's needed, and Griffin does mention, I think, that he faked his death sometime in like his 3rd or 4th year at Oxford because I think he was about to get caught or something. And now this is what he does full time. He works with the Hermes Society to steal silver from Babel. And he wants to recruit Robin. He wants somebody on the inside because the tower itself is protected by this kind of like blood magic where all of the students and the professors, like they take a vial of their blood and it's stored in the tower. And so rather than keys, basically the tower recognizes you because it has your blood and so it'll let you in. And so Griffin wants Robin to join in and like help them get access to the tower and of course the silver. And Robin is just not too sure. Like, this all seems like quite a lot. He does have this strong sense and conviction that what is happening at Babel with the silver is unethical, but he also is scared. And more than that, it's like this sense of like he wants a comfortable life. He's worked so hard to get to Oxford and to get into Babel, and now he's here. Like he can see what his life would look like if he just carried on down the path that's been set for him. And so here is a great example, I think, of the way that this book introduces some really powerful and interesting contradictions. He had his homeland taken away from him, his mother tongue, his family, everything he's ever known, his culture. And so is it so wrong that after everything that's been taken from him, he would just want a life of simple pleasures and comfort? Is it ethical for him to essentially leverage the privilege that he has been given by Professor Lovell in this whole setup with Oxford, even if it means participating directly or even indirectly in the systems of oppression itself? He has been deemed by Professor Lovell at first and now by Babel as exceptional and as useful, but he knows deep down that he will never not be expendable, because at the end of the day, he is not truly human in the eyes of Babel or of Professor Lovell. Lovell, I keep interchanging between the two. And so it's hard at first, but eventually he does decide to join Griffin and Hermes. I've been talking for quite a while, but I just wanted to mention some of the other contradictions that I think this chapter, or this book in particular, really sets up very well. There was this conversation between our students and a professor talking about like the idea of like the original Tower of Babel, and the idea that originally all of humanity spoke one language, and then, you know, God kind of split them apart. Now they speak lots of different languages. And Robin asks, you know, well, is that the purpose of Babel then? Like today, are we trying to unify the world, bring everybody together? And the professor laughs at him and basically says, well, yeah, like that's the goal of empire, bro. But the contradiction here is obviously that their magic doesn't work unless there are differences in language and in culture. Like we spoke about, it is the gap in translation and the inability to match words exactly that creates this magic. And I think that's pretty emblematic of the way that the British Empire presented itself and presents itself in this book, but also on a kind of smaller scale, how Babel presents itself. It presents itself as this kind of pinnacle of science and knowledge and education, of civility and justice and goodness. And yet its actions of dispossession, of stealing children for its own benefit. Like there's nothing aware or elevated about these actions. All of that is to say that so far I'm really enjoying this book. I don't know that I'm like loving the story inherently, like as itself, but it's thought-provoking as hell. And I'm enjoying that. I'm enjoying kind of having my own mental dialogue with the book while I'm reading. Like I said, I feel like this book is going to get pretty brutal. And I mean, this year's been a pretty rough year for me. So I definitely have been steering away from like heavier books, I've realized. That's not to say that I haven't read any books with like tension or violence even, but I definitely have been veering towards softer, more entertainment-focused stories. So it does feel a little bit different to what I've been reading this year, but I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying being back in a book that is really just making me think. Yeah, so we're back with the same angle the next day because I have just finished book 3, which means I'm about halfway through this book and shit went down in book 3. Okay, so the big plot points for book 3 were that Robin and Griffin ended up having quite a lot of tension, and after a very close call with one of their raids on Babel, Robin decides to quit the Hermes Society. But then one night, Robin sees who but Remy and Victoire basically doing a raid on Babel. But then out of nowhere, the sirens go off and Remy and Victoire get caught in this kind of like magic net thing as they're trying to flee Babel with a bunch of silver. And without a thought, without a moment's hesitation, Robin runs over to help them get out of the net thing, and he succeeds, but he ends up getting caught in the net himself. And in this moment, the three of them kind of all share this recognition of realizing that they all must have been in the Hermes Society at some point and never told each other. But obviously that is going to have to be a conversation for another day. And Robin tells Victoire and Remy that they need to run and leave him to take the fall. And so they do. The two of them leave Robin there, stuck in this net, to get caught by the authorities. Pretty soon though, it's Professor Lovell that shows up, and he takes Robin to his office. And surprisingly, Professor Lovell tells Robin that he has the choice right now to choose to pretend this never happened and have a second chance at Babel, or to fake his death and go live an uncertain, dangerous life with the Hermes Society. But if he's gonna pick Babel, he needs to give Professor Lovell some information about the society. He needs to rat them out. And to just help push him over the edge, Professor Lovell tells Robin about a time about 5 years ago when Griffin murdered a student. Her name was Evie. She was one of the best students. And Professor Lovell explains that one day when Griffin was doing a bit of a raid, Evie spotted him. She saw him. She didn't raise the alarm or do anything, but in order to cover his own tracks, Griffin killed her in cold blood. So Robin apologizes to Professor Lovell, promises that he'll never disappoint him again, and then he tells him about a secret base that Griffin had mentioned. And then pretty much immediately, I think it's the next day, if not, it's like within a couple of days, our cohort of 4 get told that they are going on a trip. We already know that 4th years are expected to go on like kind of like an international journey at the end of their 4th year. But for our cohort, this has been brought forward and it's happening like immediately. It's happening now. Our students are obviously very surprised, but Robin, Victoire, and Rami in particular are kind of freaking out. But of course they don't have any choice, so the 4 of them board a ship with Professor Lovell and they're on their way to Canton. And on this trip, Professor Lovell explains that there's some kind of like diplomatic emergency that Babel translators are needed for. And we find out that this diplomatic emergency is essentially that the British want to be able to import the opium that they're growing in India to China, because obviously there's an awful lot of money to be made, and also they want to be able to buy China's silver. However, the Chinese government don't want the opium in their country. They're just issuing a ban because they understand how harmful opium will be to its citizens. But the British are just basically not taking no for an answer. They've got $2 million worth of opium that has been confiscated by the Chinese government, and they want that back, but then they also are demanding that China allow them like free trade with their country. So Robin ends up in a room basically representing this really awful, horrible, racist British man talking to like a Chinese ambassador and their translator. And as you might imagine, it doesn't go very well. He leaves, they return to the ship, and by the time they get there, they watch as the Chinese bring out all of this opium that they've confiscated and destroy it. $2 million worth of opium in like the 1800s. It's a lot of money. And Professor Lovell immediately turns to Robin and is like, what the fuck did you say? What did you do? And so they're on the ship heading back to London in this little getaway situation, and Professor Lovell calls Robin into his office and just starts laying into him. And their confrontation escalates. They get into an altercation and Robin kills him. He kills Professor Lovell. Victoire, Rami, and Letty hear the commotion, and so they rush into the room only to find Professor Lovell dead on the ground, and they kind of look at each other and are like, what the fuck are we going to do now? And that is it. That is the end of book 3. And I mean, we've got opium being burned, we've got a murder, it's all happening. I think one of the big questions that was introduced in this chapter in particular was really like, what is the cost of revolution and whether the ends ever justify the means? You know, for example, with Griffin killing that schoolgirl Evie so that he wouldn't get found out himself, Professor Lovell paints this as like the most egregious, horrible thing any human being has ever done. Which, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not out here being excited by murder, but like, on the other hand, Professor Lovell himself is literally like out here stealing children from their homelands and bringing them to Britain to become weapons of empire, just so the British Empire can be even more violent and successful and rich than it already is. And especially for somebody like Professor Lovell, who is clearly like an active participant in empire, he also is somebody who I don't think would very often get his hands dirty directly. So it's probably very easy for someone like him to dissociate from like the very clear violence of murder. And I think on top of that, the fact that he sees himself as white and good and superior to the Chinese, for example, he doesn't see what he's done to Robin as violence. And so I do think that we are being asked by the author quite directly, is violence justifiable, especially by people who are oppressed? And I think this example demonstrates so clearly how it is so easy for people like Professor Lovell, basically people in positions of power and privilege, to take the moral high ground when it comes to violence. Because like I said, very rarely do those people get their hands dirty directly. And if they do, it's usually against people they don't see as fully human. And I think this also highlights how so often when oppressed peoples use violence against oppressors and the oppressive system, the oppressor so often sees this violence as proof that their oppression is necessary and justified. And it is further evidence to them of the moral failings of the people they already don't consider human. Like I said, I'm not out here cheering Griffin on for having killed a supposedly innocent schoolgirl. It all seems quite sad to me, but I do think it's raising some interesting questions. I think the other thing that was really interesting about this chapter was the way in which the British were just trying to frame this whole like negotiation situation as just a simple free trade issue. And like the British just wanted like open communication and this mutually beneficial trade arrangement. argument. The British were making this very kind of like high level conceptual moral argument. And it did make me think about how even today, things like free trade are often used as euphemisms by countries in the West. Kind of like very progressive, liberating sounding language like freedom and free trade. The West will very often weaponize against countries that they want access to, that they want control over, that they want resources from. We see that still today, all the time in international politics. I do think though, if I had to offer any criticism of the book so far, it would be that there is an awful lot of telling rather than showing, especially when it comes to the world building and honestly even the relationship dynamics. We get an awful lot of dialogue literally explaining things to us, but even more than that, you know, like the relationship between Robin and Rami and like the roller coasters, the ups and downs that they've been on. We don't really get to watch these ups and downs play out as much as we're told what's happening and how it's affecting each of them, which for me at least does make me feel a little bit removed from the emotions of it all and these characters that we're following. I understand the emotional complexity because the author is telling me about the emotional complexity, but I don't know that I could really say that I'm genuinely feeling it all of the time. But overall, like I am enjoying my time with this book. I think especially the fact that it's just making me have a lot of thoughts while I'm reading. And to be perfectly honest, I am just really surprised by how quickly I am getting through this. I thought that this was going to be like a really dense tome that would take me like ages to read, but it's not. It is highly readable. I mean, maybe that is because everything is so explicit. You don't have to go digging for meaning. It's all very accessible. RF Kuang is very much telling you what she wants you to know and what she wants you to take away from this book. So it is very easy to read. We've got 2 books left to go though. And I mean, now that Professor Lovell is dead, I mean, what is our cohort gonna do? But I guess we're just gonna have to find out. So I've just finished book 4. We've got 1 book left in this vlog. So I thought it was time to give you an update. So we left off at the end of book 3 with Robin's 3 friends walking in on him having just killed his father. And when they start talking about potentially throwing Professor Lovell's body overboard and like covering up his murder, Letty does, like, she seems clearly hesitant. In the meantime, they figure they're going to go through Professor Lovell's stuff to like find some information to hopefully buy them some more time. And what Robin finds is basically a bunch of correspondence between Professor Lovell and other people, essentially like planning a war with China. And this whole like translation expedition that they've just been on that kind of ended in catastrophe was basically a ruse. It was a ruse to pretend that England was interested in fair negotiations. They were not expecting to have $2 million worth of opium destroyed. That they're mad about. But they were expecting it to go wrong and that they could then use that failed negotiation as justification for war. Basically, Professor Lovell and many of the faculty at Oxford are directly involved in this conspiracy to start a war with China. And if Robin, Rami and Victoire weren't already super pissed about the whole like colonial bullshit that they've been exposed to, this just kind of tips them over the edge, especially Robin. And so the Hermes Society kind of like get together to plan to kind of counteract this proposed war. Griffin, Robin's brother, is there and he's talking straight away about violence, that they need to start like acting physically to basically cripple the British Empire. Other members of the Hermes Society, though, believe that basically lobbying Parliament would be a better way to go about it. And when things start to escalate and when the conversation around like maybe violence is necessary starts to escalate, Letty gets cold feet and she manages to kind of like sneak out of the base. And I mean, what do you know? She goes, gets the cops and tells them where the Hermes Society is. She comes back in with the cops and shoots Rami. She shoots him, kills him dead. Then we get some pretty brutal moments of literal torture. The police and people involved are literally torturing Robin for information. And at this point, like, Robin doesn't really know who's alive, who's dead. It's horrible. It's really, really intense and horrible to read. But then magically Griffin comes in and rescues Robin, and it turns out Victoire is still alive, so he rescues Victoire as well. And they're running off, but then they kind of get caught, and then Griffin gets killed, but Victoire and Robin manage to escape. And they agree between them that they are committed to continuing down this path of doing whatever is necessary to prevent the war in China. And they also understand that Babel is kind of the center of the empire's power. And the stakes are pretty high at this point, obviously. However, I do have to be honest and say that I'm not disliking Babel, but there's something about the way this book is written that is just, it's not as like engaging as I was expecting it to be. I think at the beginning we had a really good character set up with Robin, and I was interested to see where he went. But the more the book progresses, the less connected I feel to the characters as human beings, as people. It's not entirely ruining the book for me. I want to make that clear. I am still enjoying the book. I'm just enjoying it a lot less than I was at the beginning, and I'm enjoying it less than I want to be enjoying it. Enjoying isn't even the right word, but I suppose I'm less invested in the story of these characters than I want to be. I think the other thing that is making it difficult to really get super invested and to feel like the stakes are as high as they are is the fact that everything is so predictable. And I think that's intentional. Like, RF Kuang is literally telling us throughout the story, like very often, to expect bad things to happen, that these friendships are going to fall apart. You know what I mean? Like, it feels like she wants us to know what's going to happen. This might be a bit of an exaggeration, but you know, for those of you who watch the final 2 seasons of Game of Thrones, you know how it feels so much like characters are making choices just to move the plot along to where it needs to go. Whereas previous seasons, it felt like characters were making decisions that ended up resulting in them in particular situations or locations. It's that distinction for me that I don't think Babel is pulling off very well. And that is just one of my biggest pet peeves when I'm reading. Like, we've spoken about this so many times on this channel. And to me, if I'm not feeling connected to the choices, especially our main characters are making, and I don't feel like they're making them because those are the decisions those characters would make. Rather, I feel like they're making them because that's what the author needs them to decide in order to get them to the places they need to go for the plot to move in the direction it's already moving. But I guess the only thing I can put it down to is the fact that RF Kuang is trying to do so much with this book that, I mean, for only 550 pages, imagine me saying that, only 550 pages, something had to give. And at least for me, it seems like the thing that RF Kuang chose to sacrifice in order to tell this story as succinctly as she has was characterization. And that's kind of like the one thing I need to love a book. But anyway, I still have 100 and something pages to read, so I'm gonna get stuck into it, and we'll come back and do a final review. And who knows, maybe by the end of it, I will feel very differently. There's only one way to find out. I did it! I finished Babel! I'm so proud of myself! But now we're gonna dive into how the book ended, and then I'm gonna tell you, like, give you a bit of a review, my final thoughts. Before we get there though, I just wanna say that although I don't have like the glowing, wholly positive 5-star favorite book of the year kind of vibes about this book, I am going to be critical of it. I don't want that to be confused with me hating the book or disliking the book even. So please keep that in mind. Overall, I did really enjoy this book, but I mean, this is a book that provokes thoughts, and I have some thoughts. Some good ones, some bad ones, some mixed ones. So although the ending is like 100 and something pages, I suppose I'm going to break it down pretty simply for you into like the main points. Basically, Victoire and Robin decide that they are going to occupy the Tower of Babel. Like I said in our last check-in, they've come to a realization that the translators, the silver, and the power of the tower itself and the influence that it has is a core structure to the power of the British Empire. And so they decide that occupying it and essentially like striking, refusing to like offer the services of Babel, like the translation and the silver and the magic that comes with it, will hopefully encourage the British Empire to like not go to war. And so basically the two of them just like barge into the tower and say like, that's it, we're taking over the tower, we're not offering services anymore. But basically Robin stands up on a table and he gives like this little quick speech. It's a little bit clumsy, but he does it, a speech about how Babel is being used as an arm of the empire. And I mean, it works. So Robin tells any of the faculty and students who like aren't willing to be part of this strike to leave the building, and anybody who supports them, who doesn't want a war in China and who doesn't want Babel to be used in this way to like hurt and harm others, they're gonna stay and they're gonna strike. And so without the magic of the silver and without the magic of Babel, stuff starts to go wrong throughout Britain. For example, the silver has been used to keep drinking water clean, to clear out the sewerage. It's been used to power transportation to get resources around the country. It's even been used in the foundations of buildings and structures, including bridges. And so I'm sure you can imagine, without this magic, without this power, England is starting to fall apart a little bit. And essentially our strikers are pretty committed to seeing this through to the end, but like there are further questions and discussions that go on between them about how this is actually impacting the working class and poor people throughout England a lot more than it is directly influencing powerful people and politicians. England sends in the army and basically things escalate. The politicians refuse to capitulate, and eventually it gets to the point where it looks like the strike is going to be like forcibly overrun. But Robin comes up with a plan to basically destroy the tower using the silver that is in the tower. It will require 4 people to remain in the tower and basically continue like powering the silver and the magic to bring the tower down, and so those 4 people will die in the collapse. There are a couple of really powerful conversations, especially between Robin and Victoire, about essentially the lengths that they're willing to go. Victoire expresses this desire to survive, to live beyond this moment, to just be able to enjoy her life. And she also expresses concern that Robin is acting not out of like moral obligation, but instead he is very motivated by hatred and anger and a desire for vengeance. And you know, there is no denying Robin is acting out of emotion here. He's angry, he's bitter, he's resentful, and he wants revenge just as much or maybe even more than he wants justice. It's very easy to say that political action should always come from like a rational, logical, good place. But equally, it absolutely makes sense that he is acting from a place of emotion after everything he and his friends have been through. And in some ways, I think to expect him to do otherwise would be to expect him to detach from his own experience, his own trauma, and his own humanity. But equally, he knows it's unlikely that the politicians are going to agree to not go to war with China. And even beyond that, the amount of silver that they have access to, the power of Babel and their translations, like it's just skewed the global powers so much in favor of the British Empire that Robin sees destroying Babel as an opportunity to basically kind of like level the playing field. And so at the very last moment, Victoire and a few others manage to escape, leaving Robin and 3 others to stay in the tower and destroy it. And that's essentially the ending. So like I said, I do have complicated thoughts and feelings. I would say that my review of this book is kind of mixed. But one thing I want to make very clear is that even though I didn't always love the way that RF Kuang told the story, like I mentioned, I didn't always enjoy the characterizations. For me, they didn't really work as a story. They didn't draw me in the way that I want a novel to draw me in. However, ultimately, I found this book really thought-provoking, and I enjoyed having a book that was so explicit about its politics and that kind of really pushed things. I think it's very easy for people who identify somewhere along the lines of liberal progressive to really take the moral high ground with harder choices around injustice, especially when it comes to the concept and the idea of non-violence. And in fact, that moral high ground itself can and often is weaponized against people who are experiencing oppression. And I think in particular it highlights the limitations around an ideology of non-violence exclusively. And I think that's really cool, powerful stuff, especially to be presented in a book that has got such wide readership. I think too, one of the things that I really appreciated about this book is how it wasn't just about colonialism. It certainly was about colonialism, but the way that it interweaved colonialism, racism, gender, xenophobia, capitalism, exploitation in general. Like, I think it painted a very broad, interweaving kind of map of how all of these things relate and rely on each other. And I thought that was really cool. I thought it was really cool. And even though, like I said, I do have criticisms personally for where I think that this book felt a little short, ultimately, like I've mentioned, it was doing a hell of a lot. And I think it accomplished an awful lot too, in like a fairly modest page count. Now, as before, I have a lot of notes. These are in no coherent order. And honestly, I'm not even sure if I'm not done thinking about this book. So I'm just going to kind of talk at you about some of the many thoughts that I've had and hope that I can edit it into something that makes sense. So as far as things that didn't work perfectly for me, I think there were a couple of choices in terms of the plot itself that just didn't feel quite as refined or intentional as I think they could have with a little bit more revision. I think the big question I had throughout was around the silver itself. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this whole magic system is built around the art of translation, but it uses silver as like a conduit to basically like manifest that energy into magic. It's not explained too much like how and why silver is used specifically, like why that metal, why that medium, but it does mean that silver as a resource becomes very important throughout the book. However, one thing that just did feel like a little bit of like a glaring omission that we never really dealt with explicitly, at least not more than just like a passing remark, was where the silver comes from. This is a book about colonialism. It's a book that explores the details, the harms, the extent of colonialism. And yet silver, which as far as I don't know a lot about the history of the Americas, but from my understanding, a lot of silver, especially at this time in the 1800s, was mined in really kind of like horrible conditions from the Americas. It was stolen labor and stolen resources. And so the fact that this book is a book about colonialism, and yet the origins of silver weren't really addressed at all, did just feel like a little bit of a weird omission to me. And then on top of that, the fact that so much of Robin's kind of like radicalization was very much tied to the fact that he could see the ways in which the rich and the powerful were using silver and this magic to benefit themselves, but they weren't using it really to help the people in need. People like his mother. And so for a lot of this book, it kind of feels like Robin, what he wants is like a more equal distribution of the silver. But regardless of what use the silver might be put to in this utopia in Robin's head briefly, at the end of the day, it is still colonialism that brought that silver to England. And so it just felt kind of weird that we didn't have a conversation around the silver and like resources and stolen resources and labor, especially from South America, and that we didn't have a conversation about reparations then. Again, I do understand that this book was doing an awful lot, and that would have just added a whole nother layer to it, and that would have required a lot more page count. And it might be fair to say that the author wanted to focus more on the relationship between England and China, which like I get, it's valid. But equally, the relationship between the magic, the translation, and the silver, it did feel a little bit tenuous. In fact, I feel like you could almost just have the translation be the magic and remove the silver entirely. Now, another thing that did bother me, and I know I've spoken about the characterization quite a bit, but I have more to say. Who's surprised? I did want to kind of clarify something about my last clip. When I was talking about the lack of characterization and how it felt like characters were just like stereotypes who were basically just like plopped in and who did the things that RF Kuang needed them to do for the plot, I realized watching that back that it kind of could sound like I'm mad about the way the character Letty in particular was portrayed. And I just want to make it very clear that Letty was not necessarily the character I had in mind when I was talking about that. I mean, to be fair, Letty, like most of the characters, did feel a little bit two-dimensional to me, and her actions were very predictable. But I do think that the way that her character was used to demonstrate the fragility of whiteness, and essentially the way that whiteness will all too often retreat and choose comfort over justice, was, I think, a really powerful and important point for this book to make. Honestly, when I'm talking about the lack of characterization really hindering my enjoyment of the book overall and my investment in the book, I'm more thinking about characters like Robin, Griffin, and especially Victoire. Generally speaking with the plot, I also felt like there were elements that just did seem like they were chosen because they were the easy way or they were the quickest and cleanest way to get the point across. Some examples would be the fact that all four of them were made to go on that trip to China in their fourth year. Like, we had heard about these trips that all fourth year students would have to do, and we were told pretty clearly that everyone would go on their own trip to a specific place that like made sense for their area of expertise and their area of study. And so the fact that all four of them were kind of just lumped into the same trip to go to Canton, and like it made sense for Robin to go because he was part of the negotiation. He was going to be like, his skills were needed for that negotiation. The other three, there was no reason for them to go on that trip. And like they were kind of given a job when they got there, but it was clearly like just a stand-in to like explain why they were there, but it was not necessary at all. But obviously RF Kuang needed them all on board when Robin kills Professor Lovell. And so that's why they were on the trip, even though logically, as far as the plot's concerned, there was no need for them to be on that trip. And then the other one where I did laugh a little bit at just how easy it was for Victoire and Robin to take over and occupy the Tower of Babel. Like there was almost no resistance to two people walking into this 8-story building filled with scholars and students. Like it was just so easy, and how quickly and easily Robin convinced a fair number of people to stand with him. Like it was just a little bit laughable, I'm not gonna lie. So those are a few examples of where the plot just felt a little bit lackluster and flimsy to me. Even though I was engaged with the conversations, like the plot and the characters made it hard for me to get invested in this as an actual story. Overall, I think this book is a really incredible conversation starter and it asks some really great questions. I do have to wonder though if maybe the questions around the necessity of violence might have been better explored and felt more impactful had there been multiple POVs. Because everything we are learning as a reader is filtered through the experience of Robin as a character, the book does feel a little bit more like it's a back and forth in Robin's mind about the answer to that question, until of course he arrives at his own conclusion at the end of the book. I do think, for example, it would have been pretty interesting to have Griffin's point of view, where violence was necessary long before Robin thought it was. And then even like with Victoire, someone who does come to understand to an extent that violence is necessary in some cases, she still feels very strongly that violence needs to be done in certain ways to avoid, harm to the wrong kinds of people. I think exploring more of her voice too could have just enriched this whole conversation. Basically, I enjoyed the conversation so much, and I feel like it's one we don't get in fiction very often, at least not in really readily available commercial fiction, and I wanted more of it. And I feel like there were some characters in this book already primed and ready to give us more of that discussion, especially when this book offered us such a big question around what it is we are willing to sacrifice in the name of justice, and what are the limits of democracy, especially when democracy and the people in power all too often like to presume that we all have equal access to justice, when we know that that is just patently false. So I suppose I just want to end by saying that even though I didn't love this book, I did really appreciate it. I really appreciate the scope and the intention of this book. I appreciate how much RF Kuang was trying to do in what now seems like quite a short book. And so while it wasn't perfect for me as a reader, I'm left feeling like this book shot for the stars and landed on the moon. Forgive the cliche, but I think that's the best way I can put it. And I think I'm going to say something you will very rarely hear me say, and that is that I think I wish this was longer. I think I wish that RF Kuang had taken the time to make this into a series. I don't necessarily know where she'd go with the plot. I think, maybe adding in multiple POVs, for example. There's just so much here that she brought to the table, and I don't feel like we got the time to digest it all and to taste it all, and I wanted to. But equally, I still had so much to think about, and this is a book I'm going to continue to think about. So even though I didn't love it in the way I was really, really hoping I would, I cannot find it in myself to be mad at this book or to be disappointed in having read it. Thank you so much to my patrons for voting on this as my big book for the month. And thank you so much if you've made it all the way to the end of this video. I would definitely love to continue this discussion in the comments below. Let me know what you think of the book if you've read it. Let me know if you agree with me, disagree with me. I'm happy to chat in the comments. As always, a massive thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and an especially big thank you goes to Olivia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. But that is it for me this week. I will see you again next week with another bookish video. Until then, happy reading and fuck the British Empire. Bye!